And welcome to a live stream covering the ACT Chess Association's online events, which are being held here in Canberra on leadchess.org, although as Canberra is almost completely open again in terms of restrictions, these events are becoming fewer and fewer. This, in fact, is from the last round of the ACTCA Online Standard, which was a 6-round event, one with a time limit of 40 minutes plus 15 seconds per move. Even though this was the last round of this event, we are going to keep running this one until the end of the year. So I'm starting a new event next Thursday night, and it's open to all players resident in the ACT or have a connection with ACT Chess, i.e. you've previously lived here and have moved interstate. As I said, last night was the last round of this tournament, and in fact was won by Graham Saint, who is a former ACT resident who's now living in Sydney, but is very welcome to play in our events. And I think this is the second one, at least, that he has won last year and this year. Started off with a loss in the first round to Matt Radicic, but then scored 5 straight wins to win on 5 out of 6. The aforementioned Matt Radicic ended up tying for second. Started with 3 straight wins, but then finished with 3 draws to finish on 4.5 alongside Lachlan Smart, who is another Canberran who's playing remotely, in this case playing all the way from Japan. But the game I'm choosing tonight is from slightly further down the tournament between Larry Cheng and Tomoki Hirakawa. Now, interestingly enough, to buck the trend of what seems to be happening in online versus real chess, both Larry and to an extent Tomoki didn't do that well in this tournament. And in fact, Larry and his brother, Jerry, who are both juniors and both under the age, well, under 12s, actually do better in over-the-board chess than they do in online chess. Normally this is the curse of grown-ups who tend to struggle at online chess rather than over the board. But in this case, both Larry and Jerry, who are well out in the leading pack of the over-the-board event that's being currently run at the Gungahlin Chess Club, didn't do so well in this event. But nonetheless, I've chosen this game because, as with most games I choose these days, there's some instructive stuff in it. So I'm going to just start with d4, d5. So Larry Cheng is white, Tomoki is black. Knight f3, knight f6, e3. So it's a collie system, which is popular with juniors because it's generally, and adults by the way, I will point out, because it's generally a risk-free start for white. We're not doing too much in terms of hanging our pieces out there. We're looking at just putting one pawn in the center, which is the d pawn, nice and strong, developing some pieces, and then looking at attacking on the king side with a move like bishop d3, following it up with e4. So g6 was played by black, and this is actually a really good counter, I think, for the collie, because after bishop d3, the whole idea of the bishop attacking h7 just goes out the window because g6. Now, of course, white could try and expand on the king side with something outrageous like h4, h5, but normally most collie players don't play the collie just so that they can then launch some hack attacks. So bishop g7, and we play a few more moves, castles, castles. And in a sense, what we're getting here is a Grunfeld setup as black against the collie as white. Now, White's plan here is to play e4 at some point. Normally there's a few preparatory moves before e4 lands on the board, but I will show you, for example, what happens if white plays e4 straight away. So bishop g4, good old pin and win, and imagine we play e4. After d takes, knight takes. There's a couple of moves in this position. For example, knight c6, attacking the d pawn, c3 to protect it, and e5. And black is at least okay here, maybe even slightly better, because really white isn't getting an attack that they're looking for in this position. Sure, they've got a nice position, pieces are developed, but so have black. And so there's nothing here that sort of turns itself into a win for white. The other option, though, is if black tries to grab the d pawn by playing bishop takes f3. After queen takes f3, certainly the queen can jump down here and take on d4. Free pawn, you say, but not quite. Because after knight f6, bishop takes f6, the queen just jumps and takes on b7, attacking the rook, and black can move the knight here to make sure that the rooks are protecting each other. But then after queen c7, engines think this is equal. I'm less of a fan because essentially white is up a pawn. And as much as black has what we say play for the pawn, there are a few things to target. At this level of chess, online, it's 1700 versus 1300. Over the board, it's much closer to sort of 1500 versus 1000 or 800. It's very hard for black to win back this pawn. So I wouldn't willingly go into this if I was black, and so I would have stuck with knight c6 here. White actually plays c4, which is a good move, because normally collie players put that pawn on c3 to overprotect the d pawn, but c4 fighting in the center is not a bad idea. Black has a couple of choices here. One is the tricky c5. Now, again, this is one of these things that's probably the best move in this position, but early on in your chess career is quite hard to understand. I always struggled with this, and you've got a couple of choices. You can play takes here, knight here, and that's okay for black, I think. Or you can play d takes this way, trying to grab a pawn. But after knight bd7, black is probably going to win back this c pawn without too much difficulty, even if you keep trying moves like this and getting the queen to defend the pawn. Rook c8 is a good move, because that pawn is hard to defend, and the knight is moving to b4 in some lines to here, so then it can, of course, attack these pieces like this. So, but this is all opening stuff, and normally, as long as you're not blundering pawns in the opening, you're generally okay as long as you're bringing pieces out. Certainly at this level. Higher level stuff, sure, it's a lot more difficult. And white played rook e1, which is part of that plan of pushing e4 eventually. But h3 is an interesting thing to look at here, simply because, one, it asks black to decide what to do with the bishop, and I'm going to be very, very thorough here and just show you all the different choices that we've got. So, for example, I'll start at the bottom with bishop h5. You just play g4 and you trap the bishop. So that's not a good plan. Okay, bishop f5. We can just swap bishops, and as much as the white squared bishop white uses a lot to do some attacking, I just don't like the ugly arrangement of pawns here. There's just too many weaknesses now in this position around the king. Bishop e6, and we get c takes, of course, and here you've got two knight takes. And in a sense, white has to play something like a3 simply to stop either knight going to the b4 square. But even after a3, you're probably okay to play e4 and drive the knight away, and you're actually threatening d5 here. So white can be kind of happy with bishop e6. Black could play here instead, but after e4, bishop here, you can see this happening now. It doesn't work straight away, because if the pawn takes either of the pieces on c6 or e6, the queen is hitting the bishop on d3, but it's an annoying threat to face. Let's come back to retreating the bishop one more square to d7. We just take, and again a3, following up by e4. We could run all the way back to c8, and then a3 again. So we notice the theme here, especially in the collie system, and this is a clue for black as well, that knight c6 b4 does work in a lot of lines against the collie, because you actually eliminate the one thing that white really wants to hang on to, which is the d3 bishop. We could just take, of course, and then after knight takes f3, white is happy again with this position, because that knight might end up going to e5. So they're all the choices after h3, and most of them are either equal or better for white, so h3 probably could have been played here. Rook e1 was played, and then rook b8. I didn't understand this move. This is just too slow. I'm not sure what black is trying to get with a move like rook b8. It's a bit of a nothing move. e5 was better, with the obvious threat of just playing e4 to fork two pieces. And after takes and takes, that knight actually is now a very powerful piece. It's attacking the knight on f3, which is pinned. It's attacking the bishop on d3, which is hanging. And it's attacking the pawn on c4. And if the bishop retreats to break the pin and save the bishop, takes, takes, knight takes, queen takes. And the suggestion here is that black is a little better. And I agree with it simply because it's not a little better because I've captured more material, but basically black's pieces are on good squares at the moment. White's still got this issue of moving the knight on d2 to a better square, and then finding something for the bishop on c1 to do. And in both cases, it's going to take a little bit of time. And in the meantime, black is just going to play nice moves like bringing the rook to the e file, possibly cementing the knight on e4. So black has a better position because it's easier for black to do things in this position. Instead, after rook b8, white played queen b3, which again I'm slightly scratching my head about because it's putting the queen actually on the same file as the rook. Now maybe white thought that there were some tactics. And there are some tactics which white plays for, and having the queen on b3 kind of makes sense. Because after d takes c4, bishop takes c4, before I was talking about the bishop on d3 trying to play along this diagonal, but with this guy here, it's difficult. So sensibly, the bishop now gets to play upon this diagonal. So f7 is the target, which is the target in a lot of games, even games that start with d4 rather than e4. So bishop takes, knight takes, but here black missed a very instructive move, which was knight a5. And again, we're forking the two pieces. Now, we're not going to win the bishop. That doesn't matter. The queen's going to go to d3. The knight will take, and queen takes. But this position is pretty equal now. And the reason why I'm saying it's pretty equal, and if you were a slightly lower rated player and you're playing a stronger player who plays this opening as white, you should be happy you've reached this position. And the reason you should be happy was white had all these great plans about attacking with the bishops and the knights and the queens, and you've eliminated most of those. So that plan of using those pieces and that center to attack has disappeared. Now, if you're super lucky in terms of your opponent, it may well be that's all your opponent knows in the position. Now, it's not true in this case, knowing both players, but sometimes you might get to a position where a collie player has put all the eggs in the I'm going to checkmate on h7 basket. And when that doesn't happen, then they just play a lot of planless moves. So swapping those pieces off, I think, is good for black in this position. And this position's quite equal because what I'm saying is that the knight on f3 and the queen on c4 are basically white's only attacking pieces, and the bishop on g7, the knight f6 should deal with this quite happily. Instead, e6, and that first looks like it's a sensible move because it's stopping the bishop on the diagonal, but it turns out that it provides a little bit of a target for white, sorry. But white initially plays bishop d2. Turns out this is a good move because it simply stops the knight from going to a5. You don't have to rush. You can take your time. a6, looking to support b5, but it turns out b5 is too slow. But I must confess, I suspect that one of the reasons why white got a massive attack launched is because black just didn't expect it. Now, on the one hand, knight g5 here is dubious, but I'm not going to say that these moves are absolute howlers, even though one of them is, because before you play lots and lots of chess, sometimes these things come as genuine surprises. Bishop h6 is the right move here, but again, I'd be surprised if below a certain level this would be an easy move to spot, because essentially you're forcing either white to retreat back to f3 where you've wasted time, or whatever sacrifices happen don't work. So knight takes e6, f takes e6, bishop takes e6, king h8, and the queen and the bishop surprisingly don't work that well together in attacking in this position. This is the sort of position you wish you still had your knight. So that doesn't really work. You've sacrificed a piece for 2 pawns, but you're not really getting a huge attack here. Bishop takes e6 is worse because instead of pawn takes bishop, knight takes bishop, you just take the knight here and you've just won a piece. Keep an eye out for that because often you get sucked into sort of going, I've got to take the piece that was sacrificed, and you forget to take the piece that was on offer. You can play knight takes f7, hoping for rook takes f7, bishop takes e6, and then you're picking up the exchange later. I mean, you have swapped off a couple of pieces, 2 pieces for the rook, but you have picked up 2 pawns in the meantime, so that's actually good for white. But king takes f7 is stronger. And then after bishop check, you just move the king to g7. And although this is positions considered a little bit unclear, and to be honest, a stronger player with white might very well beat a weaker player with black from this position. Objectively, I think it's easier for black to play for a win in this position. It's in checkmate basket, while black has more options in defense. Instead, after knight g5, b5 was played, and sadly this is a mistake, not because it ignores the sacrifice on e6. I think white was hell-bent on sacrificing on e6 no matter what. Left the knight on c6 undefended, which is important in an upcoming line. So the bishop sacrifice, perfectly. The other option is to play the queen. This is, you've either got a happy pawn in some lines, or you've just got your attack still going. After f takes e6, it was white's turn to go slightly, miss a chance, I suppose, not slightly wrong, missed a chance. Queen takes e6 was the right move here. Not because after king h8 you're looking at these other checkmate type tricks with knight f7, but more, as I said before, that knight was undefended on c6 and you just take it. And then for that kind of sacrifice, which originally was intended to try and checkmate the king, actually just won 3. And the a6 pawn is weak as well. So yeah, this is just they're better for white. Instead, played knight takes e6, which kind of makes sense on one level, in that you are forking the queen and the rook, and you're threatening some discovered checks by moving the knight happily down on b3. So it looks attractive. Again, this is probably players and 2,000 rated players. 1,500 rated players will go, well, this is my plan, and I'll just keep playing it. As long as my plan doesn't go off the rails, I'm going to stick with it. The stronger player will go, can I find a different plan is better, which was queen takes e6. So knight takes e6, queen d6, knight takes f8, just, pick up the rook here. And this is where black does go wrong. And again, I'm not quite sure why. King takes f8 is the right move. Rook ac1 follows up, and it's simply a rook and 2 pawns worth 7 points against 2 knights. It's still, a little bit of hard work because the extra piece might overrun white rather than the extra rook overrunning black. And I'm not sure why black didn't play king takes f8. Don't know whether they're afraid of bishop b4, pinning queen against king, but the knight on c6 deals with it for now. Instead, they kind of panicked and played king h8. And of course, the knight just came back. And now it's a rook and 2 pawns just for a knight. So at this stage, white is completely winning, and white didn't really mess up after this. But I will show you the rest of the game just to show you how you need to still play carefully to convert, essentially to convert positions that you're better in. So bishop h6, turns out it could have been a useful move later on. It was certainly a useful move earlier when it wasn't played. So rook over here to hit the knight. Rook goes to e8 to ask the knight to politely get off e6, which it does by moving to c5. And black played knight g4. So even though white is winning based on material, etc., etc., don't rule out the fact that black still has some threats here. And the knight going to g4 at least lines up h2 for the queen as well. And g3 might have been safe. f4 was played. Now, it turns out f4 was perfectly okay, but it did give black a chance to sort of randomize a little bit of the position. And it's kind of important sometimes to take your chances where you can. So if black really wants to make life as hard as possible for white, there was bishop takes f4. Now, this doesn't work, but only if white plays the right move. If white plays autopilot, actually it can just go up and blow up in their face, because after e takes, queen takes d4. And if you play king f1, you just get mated straight away with queen f2. So you don't play king f1. If you play knight h1, king h1, sorry, then you walk into the well-known Philidor's legacy. Knight check here, king to g1, knight to h3, double check. Note that you're under attack from both queen and knight. King to h1, and then you sack your queen on g1 like a boss. Queen g1 can't be taken by the king because the knight's protecting. Rook takes, and then you play knight f2 mate. If white wasn't aware that was coming, there's a good chance white could walk straight into that one. Instead, bishop e3. So we come back to this position after queen takes d4. You've got to play bishop e3. You can play rook e3, by the way, but I won't go too far. So we play bishop e3, and after knight takes e3, you've won back your piece. And so suddenly it's a rook for a knight, and you've still got some good, tricky attacking chances. But if white finds, and white kind of has to find queen c3, then it looks like white will be okay. Because if you play queen takes c3 now, rook takes, and the pin down the e file means the knight can't move to safety. And the rook will take the knight, and white will just be winning. And if we don't, okay, basically queens are going to come off anyway, because the queen can't move to safety because of essentially the pin all the way along this the pin all the way along this diagonal here. But white would really have needed to find queen c3 here. So all the way back here, sure, it doesn't work, but if you wanted to mix it up, consider that move. So instead, knight went back to e7, and now it's pretty much easily winning for white. Queen f7's a nice move. Rook f8 could have been played here instead of rook g8, but you just play queen e6. And the advantage for white now is white can always offer the exchange of queens. And once the queens come off, there's not really going to be an attack, and then white's extra material is going to win, noting that these pawns here can be a little bit weak as well. So the rook went to g8. Knight jumps back to e4, hits the queen, looking at going to f6 to support queen h7, although the knight on g4 is a bit pesky at the moment. Queen retreats to safety. Bishop went to c3. Not saying this is a cheapo, but it's a fairly useful way of trying to win this position. Possibly knight to d5 here would have worked as a defense, but rook f8 was played to drive the queen away, but missing d5 check. Okay, and the bishop is now attacking the king. After you put the bishop back here, queen takes g7 is mate. And that's how the game ended. So it wasn't a perfect game. There were a couple of little mistakes here, but on the other hand, I think it's a typical game played between players of this rating, where white has a plan to checkmate black. Black doesn't really have a plan except to react to what white is doing all the way through. And when left to their own devices, will occasionally just play slightly nothing moves like rook b8, which then can be taken advantage of. And then there was some tough defense in the middle, plus an attempted swindle, which wasn't played for towards the end. But otherwise, I'll see lots of games played like this in lots of chess tournaments. And really, it just becomes a question of the player who makes the fewest mistakes is going to be the player that wins. Having said that, clearly white had an idea, which they tended to follow through for most of the game, and were flexible enough to change that plan where necessary, with moves like c4 and getting the bishop onto these diagonals as well. So that was from last night's ACTCA Online Standard, played at leechess.org. It was the final round. The tournament was won by Graham Saint with 5 out of 6. I am starting a new tournament next week on Thursday night at 7 p.m. My name is Sean Press. I run these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association and do these streams the day after. Thanks for watching in. A little bit of a plug. It is Movember. I am growing a moustache. If you go to the Movember page and look for me, Sean Press, SHAUNPRESS, feel free to make a donation to my Movember fund if you can. So until probably next Friday, thanks for tuning in, and I'll be seeing you later.